So, 2020 wasn't a great year for film. Because of the pandemic, so many films were delayed, and because of that, I honestly didn't see that many compared to previous years. So, because of that, rather than doing a top 10 best and worst of each year, instead I'm going to be doing top 5s, and I'm going to be covering them all in one video. So I'm going to be going through my top 5 favourite, my top 5 least favourite, and several in the middle that I want to briefly talk about. I'm not going to go the most in-depth on this, because I don't want this video to be an hour long. But if you want to see my full list on this, be sure to check it out on letterboxd.com, link in the description down below. And with that said, let's get into the top 5. So, at number 5, I have got The Gentleman, which is Guy Ritchie's newest film. It released around January this year, and this just feels like a really good return to form for Guy Ritchie. He's been in a bit of a weird patch. Ever since he did the Sherlock Holmes movies, he's been straying further and further away from his original style, and it's nice to see him go back to this. I think that the cast and the performances they give are all really good, and the characters it presents are really good as well. A lot of the subplot elements, they fit in really nicely. I think the storytelling angle, whilst cliche, does still feel very fresh, and once again, Guy Ritchie's dialogue is really good. It's an exciting, well-paced movie. It does have some problems with the script here and there. Some elements in it are a bit weird tonally, but for the most part, this is a really enjoyable film, and like I said, I like the way it goes back to Guy Ritchie's original filmmaking elements. At number 5, we have Soul. It's the most recent Pixar film that came out on Disney Plus just like a couple of weeks ago. But in terms of what I was expecting, I didn't really know what to think. But watching it, I think Soul is a pretty good title. This is Pixar going back to its very core emotional elements here. It plays around with your feelings, it plays around with some very creative concepts here, and above all else, it just has heart and character, which is something that I think Pixar was missing in its other film this year, Onward, which really missed the mark for me. But yeah, Soul, it had a really nice art style, it was still able to do something original, it felt really fresh, it had a lot of great dramatic moments, and yeah, I'm going to remember this one for a while. Number 3, I have Devil All the Time. Now, this is the first film I have seen from Antonio Campos. It was original to Netflix, and Netflix didn't market this very well in my opinion, because I was not looking forward to it based on the way Netflix had marketed it, but I loved it. I really like this movie. For starters, it shows a lot of actors doing things that I didn't know they were capable of, in particular Tom Holland, who gives a really good performance in this movie. But as well as that, the acting as a whole is really good. There are lots of different little story elements that are thrown around the place, and they're almost anthology-like in terms of little segments of each story are told, and then they're brought back to come back together in this grand finale. And yeah, I really like the storytelling. I think the direction's very good. I think the characters are all very well done. Overall, it's a great script. It is very interpretive in terms of how it's done. And like I said, some of these anthology elements are a bit wild at times, but as soon as you see where they're heading with them and adapt to this kind of storytelling, it is something really worth it. Number 2, we have Mank. This is David Fincher's newest film, and it's about the writer of Citizen Kane, who is played by Gary Oldman. And from a filmmaking point of view, this is the best film of the year. The amount of attention that has gone into the directing, the cinematography, the editing, the post-production, all of that is incredible. This is such a brilliant looking film. So much attention was put into making it look like it was released in the 1940s. And that's not just things like, oh, they made it black and white. You know, a lot of the things they do with the audio and the sound mixing. You know, some of the color correction in terms of how they play around with their blacks and whites in the film. It's really well done, and despite that, you can also see this really good cinematography, this really good production design, the performances, in particular Gary Oldman, who gives a really good performance here. Charles Dance is also really good in this movie, and overall, this is just a really good way of telling a story, and in terms of pure storytelling, this is a great movie. Unfortunately, I wasn't too invested in the script. Like, I followed it, I did enjoy it, however I think its pacing was off at some bits, and whilst I was invested in what was going on, it was never the writing that was keeping my focus, it was always the filmmaking. Which is why I put it at the second place and not first, which is where we go to a film that is very much carried by its script. And my favourite film of 2020 is I'm Thinking of Ending Things. This was written and directed by Charlie Kaufman, who is a very out there screenwriter in terms of what he tries to do with his films. And yeah, that's a very good way to describe this film. It's very out there. There's a lot that this film wants to deliver here in terms of its messages about depression, its messages about aging and relationships and the way we approach them. It's really thought-provoking, and I think it's really well sold. I think that the visual storytelling, for a guy who hasn't directed too much, this is surprisingly solid in terms of his visual presentation. I think the pacing of this film is really good. The dialogue is great. A lot of the editing tricks are really well done. The acting's really good, the music's really good. Like I said, the only things that really hold it back are that it's just so out there and interpretive that you can't find a definitive end, but what you can find are all sorts of little themes spread along the film and plenty of other things to enjoy from this film, which is why it's my favourite movie of 2020. However, with that said, all 5 of the movies I have said I highly recommend. And now I'm going to quickly go through some other movies, not all of them, like I said. First up, we have what would be at number 6, if I did a top 10 list, which is Tenet, Christopher Nolan's film that released in cinemas sort of in between COVID waves, and because of that it got screwed over financially. But this film, I think it did need to be in cinemas, because the kind of spectacle that this film delivers is something that, 1, only Christopher Nolan could make, and 2, I think it's one that would only work in cinemas. This is Christopher Nolan playing very much to his strength, so if you like his films, then you're going to like this movie. If you dislike his films, or you're a bit iffy on them, you're not going to like Tenet. Tenet is pure spectacle. The story really does take a back seat here, which is my main criticism I would give it, but in terms of all these action set pieces, in terms of this cool sci-fi concept, that's all really well done. It's an exciting movie with some pretty good character moments, some really great action sequences, but ultimately it's very thin when it comes to the story. The Five Bloods, a film that everyone has been highly praising as one of the best films of the year, I don't think it's quite there, but I still do quite like it. I like how it sort of flips between real life and the Vietnam War. I really like its exploration of its characters. I think that this film is able to be really dark and grim, whilst also still being pretty funny. There's a lot of energy behind what's going on in this, and whilst I think the story does sort of fall apart around the middle, and whilst the pacing could be better, I do think it's quite well interspliced by some of the footage of the Vietnam War, both real and shot in the movie. But ultimately, it's well directed enough. I just think it's not really the kind of story that works for me, but nonetheless, I liked it. Next up, we have Borat, subsequent movie film. This is a sequel that was made 14 years after the original, but the way it comments on the pandemic and the culture of today is still pretty good as it was in the first film. I do think that at some places it did pull its punches, and that's mostly because of the fact that we've seen a lot of this before. But yeah, some of its punches were pulled. I think the elements between Borat and his daughter were well done, although I think that the way they conveyed that wasn't too good. It was a bit conventional in some places, but for the most part, this is still a really fun movie. And yeah, I really like this movie. Next up, we have The Invisible Man, which is a film that I think is a bit of a mixed bag. I really like the idea of this invisible stalker that is just unrelentingly going after someone to terrorize them. That's a cool horror premise. It's directed by Leigh Whannell, who is a very talented director, and I think he really showed it here. When it came to the action and the horror sequences, he was able to give a lot of tension from his directing. Unfortunately, there are several breaks in logic that happen in this. In particular, if someone's clearly invisible attacking you, why are you not paying attention to the fact that they're attacking you, and instead you're looking at someone you can see? It's just a bit weird like that. There are a lot of holes in the plot you can point out. Certain other parts of it I think are quite slow or conventional in the script, but for the most part this is a pretty entertaining movie, and I'm interested to see what Leigh Whannell does next. Next up, we have The New Mutants, which falls perfectly in the line of okay, this is just a perfectly average film, and honestly, that's both its greatest strength and weakness. I think as a whole, the cast were really good and their characterization worked quite well, with the exception of Sunspot, who I feel was very undercooked. Pun absolutely intended. I thought that the villainous presence did not work whatsoever. I think that the horror in this, again, didn't work, but if you look at it in terms of a character study, it works pretty well. I like the idea of them being in this facility. I don't like how they tried to tie it into the rest of the X-Men universe. That didn't work for me. I also think this film has some pretty bad dialogue at some points, but you know, it's watchable, it's there, it's fine. Then there is Sonic. That is a film that I thought was going to be awful, and I was wrong. It wasn't exactly bad, but I wouldn't say it's good by any means. Like, this movie's just a kid's film, basically. It's just a mixture of Detective Pikachu and some other movies that we've seen before. Sonic himself, I think, is quite annoying in the movie. A lot of the humor's quite bad. Jim Carrey does steal the show as Dr. Eggman, but beyond that, none of the cast are interesting. A lot of the script is very generic, and whilst it is enjoyable to some extent, it's just not for me. Then we have Wonder Woman 84, which is a film that I thought was going to be good and ended up not being very good. This film is really, really, really underbaked when it comes to the script. The pacing in this film is awful. It goes through a break of about an hour where nothing exciting is going on. Wonder Woman is a non-presence in half of this movie. Although to the film's credit, whenever she is here, she is a really great presence. This film has a lot of really light-hearted moments, but whenever it tries to be funny, it doesn't really land. The plot can be way too goofy at points, so if you look at it in terms of knowing that it's goofy, then that's fine. But as soon as you start taking a look at what the actual plot is, it just falls into a million pieces. I don't think that the villains really worked in this film. I think that the ending felt like a complete cop-out. It's just a really weird script. The last movie before going into the bottom 5 is Mulan. However, I will just say that pretty much every review I have seen referring to Mulan gives pretty much the same opinion I have, so just go and watch someone else's review, because, yeah, their opinion will be the same as mine. So, my 5th worst movie of 2020 was Birds of Prey, which is a film that I don't know what they were going for here, to be honest. All of the humour fell completely flat on its face. The pacing and the structure of this film was way off, and a lot of the camp and darker elements just didn't mesh well for me. The only member of the Birds of Prey that actually felt like a character was Harley Quinn. The rest of them were given barely any screen time. And whilst I will say that this film didn't really bore me at any points, and it definitely had some good acting, this is just something I never really want to watch again. It's just not very good. At number 4 we have Scoob, who decided to make an animated theatrical Scooby-Doo movie with Dick Dastardly and Muttley as the villains. Why? As well as that, there's the weird casting choices of things like Zac Efron as Fred that are just strange to me. But yeah, this movie does not work one bit. The animation style just feels off in some ways. The structure is actually awful. The pacing's terrible. The weird superhero elements they throw in this suck. The movie is never funny when it's trying to be funny. The characters are all badly done, and for a Scooby-Doo movie, it really heavily shafts Fred, Daphne, and Velma. For some reason, Simon Cowell's in it. I'm sure he got a lovely paycheck from it, but yeah, I've got no words to describe Scoob. It's just awful. At number 3, I have Bloodshot, a film that I can hardly remember because it's the exact same thing I come to expect from Vin Diesel action movies. Vin Diesel himself just plays a boring character once again. The action scenes are incredibly forgettable and poorly shot. All of the side characters are just caricatures, and this film has absolutely nothing going for it. I can't remember a thing about the story, to be honest. The concept didn't interest me, the characters didn't interest me. This is just a really forgettable movie. At number 2, we have Dolittle. Why did they make this? I genuinely don't know who this movie was for. It marketed itself to be this grand journey, and you can see that at some points where it's trying to go for this grand, serious approach, but then you have so many jokes that only people under the age of 7 would find funny. The CGI in this movie isn't great. The guest cast that play characters are clearly only there for name recognition, and Robert Downey Jr. honestly feels off in this movie. He's definitely acting in some scenes, but I don't feel his heart's in it in this movie. The story itself is just strange. The script's filled with a lot of weird adult jokes and tonal nightmares. It's not very well paced. This film's just... yeah, it's just so strange. I keep on criticizing films for their scripts, but in Dolittle's case, the script is especially what lets it down. Speaking of scripts letting the film down, number 1 for the worst movie of 2020, we have Artemis Fowl. I would say the script let it down, but to be honest, literally everything in the movie lets Artemis Fowl down. We've already got a contender. You know, 1 year in, we've got a contender for the worst film of the 2020s, this whole decade. This film fails on pretty much every level. There is not one redeeming quality to this movie. So for starters, this film is determined to say that it's all really cool, but it's not really cool. It's a really stupid world that doesn't give us any character to be invested in, or any concepts that we understand or that are explained properly. And every time I try to get invested, my immersion is broken by awful childish humour. The actor that played Artemis Fowl was really bad, and his character I just found to be annoying. This film's really confused in terms of its tone, in terms of its character's motivations. The visual design is ugly, the pacing sucks, the editing sucks, a lot of the dialogue sucks, all of the characters are forgettable and boring, and none of the actors really tried when it came to this movie. Come to think of it, I don't think anyone tried with Artemis Fowl. From the looks of its production design and its CG, it all looks really cheap to me. And from the looks of the script, it just felt like this got quickly thrown out there. It's an absolutely dreadful script, it fails at its world building, it fails at its characters, and I never want to watch this movie again. This fails on pretty much every level possible, and the only thing I will give it is they quickly threw it onto Disney Plus so that I didn't have to pay for it. And with luck, I'll never watch this movie again, and I'll just be able to forget about its existence. And with that, well, that's the worst movie of 2020, and, well, thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm trying out a new sort of idea here with this kind of a video, so let me know what you think about that down below. And if there are any films you want me to give my thoughts on, because there are a few I was thinking of doing individual reviews on, let me know in the comments down below. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.